This is a recording of a Climate Policy Initiative webinar, originally broadcast on September the 4th, 2014. The webinar, How to Deploy CSP and Reduce Its Costs, was presented by Martin Stadelman, Senior Analyst at CPI, and Gianleo Frazzari, a Fellow also here at CPI. For those of you who are not familiar with Climate Policy Initiative, we work to improve the most important energy and land use policies around the world. We support decision makers through in-depth analysis on what's working and what's not. This webinar shares the findings of a year-long study on the role of public finance in increasing deployment and reducing the cost of concentrated solar power. Concentrated solar power is a promising low-carbon energy technology. The project would not have been possible without the technical and financial support of the climate investment funds. The webinar begins with Zhihong Zhang, Senior Program Coordinator at the Climate Investment Fund's Administrative Unit, explaining their interest in supporting analysis of this technology.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for the invitation. First, a word about the CIF, the Climate Investment Funds. We're currently the world's largest public fund dedicated to fighting climate change, supporting investments in climate-smart development in more than 50 low-income and middle-income countries. We work in partnership with the World Bank and the 4 regional development banks, governments, both donors and receiving countries, CSOs, private sector, and other stakeholders. The CIF was established in 2008 to test new modalities for delivering climate finance at scale and to help countries transition toward low-carbon and climate-resilient development pathways. We share the lessons we learn along the way with many stakeholders within the broader climate finance and development communities. Learning, therefore, is a critical part of our mission and is embedded in so much of what we do. The concentrated solar power, the CSP investments that the CIF supports, are contributing to both in-country and global learning on policies, price support mechanisms, bidding mechanisms, financing arrangements, project costs and timelines, and project risk assessments and allocation. Our goal in commissioning this CSP knowledge work from CPI was to identify which lessons can be applied to positively influence the replication and scale-up of CSP, especially by commercial investors and developers in CIF pilot countries and beyond. Through the Clean Technology Fund, the CIF is investing a substantial amount of concessional finance, over $1.2 billion, in CSP projects, and is supporting CSP in every emerging market in which it is being pursued. The Middle East and North Africa, in Chile, South Africa, and India. The CTF receiving countries and the multilateral development bank partners, as well as the governing bodies of the CTF, they think there are compelling reasons to develop such a large portion of the CIF portfolio towards CSP, which the presenters from CPI will discuss shortly. In an effort to advance critical thinking under our knowledge management program, in July 2013, the CIF commissioned and partnered with CPI on a year-long project to distill lessons on targeting concessional finance to support CSP. The project included 2 case studies on CSP investments in India and South Africa, and 3 international CSP dialogues. The work that CSP has carried out, which the presenters will present shortly, has helped to significantly advance the knowledge base on how public support in the form of both funding and policy can be targeted more effectively to bring down costs and expand CSP development in countries that are committed to adding CSP to their energy mix. Their analysis includes a number of specific recommendations directed at national governments, donors, and development partners on how each group can more effectively support this potentially transformational source of renewable energy. For our part, the CIF is continuing to provide low-cost financing for CSP projects. And for example, recently we approved under CTF $238 million for 350 megawatt expansion of the Morocco's Morocco CSP complex. This is just one of the recent approvals under CSP. As I said, we have a portfolio of over $1.2 billion under CTF. Thank you for joining us this webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to colleagues from CPI. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shihong, very much for the introduction. So now, without further ado, we'll hand over to Martin Stadelman and Gianleo Frazzari, who will present the findings of this year-long analysis of CSP markets and projects around the world.
Well, thank you, Dan, and hello to everybody. So here in the next slide, you see what Gianleo and me are going to present you in the next roughly 20 minutes. First of all, why we're so much interested in concentrated solar power and particularly emerging economies. Then our approach to analyze the question how to deploy CSP and reduce its cost and the lessons both for national policies and international public finance. And we'll finalize with a quick outlook to the future of CSP. Why CSP in emerging economies? Why CSP? CSP technology uses solar energy, which is an abundant energy source, to both generate low carbon electricity, but also to deliver base load and peak load power with heat storage. So actually we see two benefits of CSP, the provision of low carbon power, but also the ability to store heat and thereby provide power when it's most needed as peak load power, or even reliably around the clock, so as base load power. And why emerging economies? You see this on the next slide in this graph. If you look on the left, the plants that have been commissioned, we clearly see that Spain is leading the way with 70% of global installed generation capacity. But when we move to the future, looking at the plants where financing has been secured and they're under construction on the right, there is clearly a shift towards emerging markets. So first of all, we still see Spain and United States leading the way, but China, Middle East, North Africa, India and South Africa are not far behind. Now, why this switch to emerging economies? It's clear that these countries have ever-growing energy demand and they try to reduce the dependence on imported fossil fuels. But also what we see then is that CSP is one of the only ways of actually replacing coal power as one of the main emitting sources for greenhouse gases. The switch to emerging markets also has some implication in terms of project finance, as some of the risks clearly increase, for instance, policy risk, but also financing risk. Alongside the shift towards emerging markets, we also see a shift towards new CSP technologies. You see at the left of this graph that for commissioned plants, parabolic trough plants is clearly leading with 90% of installed capacity, while when we look into the future for financing secured or just plants that have been announced and are planning now, or where we have already just permits, there's clearly a shift towards power tower technologies, which is you see in the picture on the bottom right, and also linear Fresnel on the top right. This switch towards new technology also implies new technology risks. And this brings us to the challenges for scaling up CSP. First of all, there are high costs compared to other electricity resources, so around 3 times more expensive than the cheapest renewable energy plants. This is also why we found that around 98% of CSP investments still need public support today. The second challenge are financing risk, and this is due to the 3 times higher investment costs than other renewable energies. These investment costs also imply high capital costs, and this is particularly an issue in emerging economies where capital costs are anyway high. The third challenge are technology risk, or the knowledge gap. And this is not just due to the switch to new technology, it's also basically because we see that the installed capacity of CSP is much lower than wind and PV. We estimate it at 1% of wind and around 3% of PV. Starting from these challenges, there are the 3 following questions we asked in this study. The first question was, how can national policy tools deploy CSP at low cost? The second one was how can international public finance best support national policy efforts, particularly in emerging economies? And the third and last question, how can public support drive long-term cost reductions and ensure scale-up of CSP? To answer these three questions, we have used a specific analytical approach, which was mainly based on case studies. Xiong already mentioned the case studies you have done for the CIF on the Rajasthan Sun Technique plant in India and the Eskong Upington plant in South Africa. We also, even before, did a study on the Noor 1 plant in Morocco. By this, we actually covered the three main technologies of CSP and also analyzed plants without storage, but also the one in South Africa with 9 to 12 hours storage. So this plant can even provide electricity for 9 to 12 hours when the sun is not shining anymore. Adding on this, we looked at the Spanish CSP market, which is interesting as the largest market with 2.3 gigawatts installed, but also because we see a large increase in a short time, but also a really rapid decrease due to policies. So we looked at the policies there. And finally, we did the free CSP expert dialogues to back up our lessons with project developer, investors, and policymakers. So I'm handing now over to my colleague Jaleo Frisari for the lessons.
Thank you, Martin, for the introduction, and welcome everybody listening to this webinar from my side as well. In the next few slides, I'm going to present a quick overview of the 5 main lessons that this year of research on CSP has led us into. And then before giving the word back to Martin for the final remarks of the future of CSP, I'm going to group these lessons and convert them in kind of recommendation for the key policymakers we have identified in the study. National and local policymakers on one side and international public finance actors on the other. The first lesson concerns the cornerstone policy to decide on the support and allocate the support to the different CSP projects. Evidence from the projects that have been financed since from 2006 to the end of 2013 clearly shows that feed-in tariffs have driven the deployment of the technology more effectively than anything else, but they have struggled to prompt any meaningful technology cost reductions. We'll see it in the next chart, how this evidence came from the data. On the other side, especially lately, auctions and bidding have proved much more effective in pushing down the level of support, but whenever the bids have come in too low out of the auctions, the impact on deployment has been actually less satisfactory than expected. The chart on this slide maps all the projects, the levelized investment cost on the vertical side of all the projects of utility scale in CSP that have been financed since 2006 to the end of 2013 globally, and whenever we had availability of data and transparency on the financing terms. 4 main remarks are possible out of this slide. First of all, many policies type have been attempted with CSP, and their results have been quite dispersed. Second, most of the installations have been due to clearly to the Spanish feed-in tariff that has led the deployment, that has actually made the market in the technology. But putting all the projects along a timeline, we really cannot see a meaningful pattern of cost reduction due to any economies of learning. Third, especially lately with the latest installations in India, South Africa, and Morocco, we have seen that have been achieved mostly through reverse auctioning and tenders. We've seen that some cost reductions had actually appeared for CSP, although especially in the case of India, the deployment has been a bit critical. Finally, with the new technology specification, especially Tower and to a more limited extent Fresnel, are showing some ability to drive cost reductions compared to the parabolic trough systems that have dominated the market in the previous years. The second lesson is on the level, on the decision about the level of support and its stability over time. First and foremost, policymakers have to provide a sufficient financial support to close the viability gap of the technology. This is to ensure private investors can achieve the required rate of returns, as any time the financial support proves lower than what is needed from the private side, deployment seems to suffer, and this has been quite evident in the case of a few Indian projects. Second, the level of support needs to be maintained close to the real technology cost to make it sustainable over time for public budgets and avoid booms and busts, excessive capacity deployment on one side and a complete halt of installation on the other. As this chart shows, plotting together yearly capacity installations in the countries we have analyzed with the timeline of the policies, it's clear that annual installations follow the timeline of the policy. Most of all the installations in Spain occurred while the feed-in tariff was active, leading to boom years like the 2011 one, followed by years, much more meager years, and actually years with no installation at all, when the feed-in tariff was first reduced and then amended completely. Also, in the case of the loan guarantee program in the US, the orange bar shows how all the installations in the country are focused in the period where the loan guarantee program was actually effective, and actually focused just in the month before the guarantee program was about to end. The third lesson is on risk, and now risk matters for the cost of CSP project. First of all, to ensure deployment, policymakers need to mitigate those risks the private sector is not yet willing to bear, although they have to make sure that the private sector has a financial stake in the project, has some risk of the project. Second, it's important to reduce the perception of policy risk by ensuring that the interest from both the public and private actors are aligned. We've tried to break down the tariff coming out of two CSP projects we've analyzed in the Indian case on the left-hand side and the Moroccan case on the right-hand side in a few components, starting from the risk due to the policy, the policy setting, the tariff setting policy, and then the impact of concessional finance. Concentrating on the first part, we see the second red column in each chart. We've seen that the policy de-risk effect due in the case of Morocco to the public-private partnership between the developers and the government, and the public backing of the power of taker in India in the case of Rajasthan, have significantly reduced the level of the bids that have come out as winners in the auction. The fourth lesson is on the role of financing packages in reducing the cost. Especially international finance, can reduce CSP costs either by intervening directly into the cost of the projects, providing concessional or just better terms, like in the case of India, a longer-term financing package compared to what the national banking system was prepared to offer. Or, as in the case of Morocco, international finance can support national budgets when countries are willing to support the technology, but are unable to bear the full cost of closing viability gap. Going back to the same chart as before, and moving on the right-hand side in the breakdown in the waterfall of the tariff, we can see how the longer maturity finance in the case of India, in the small chart on the left, reduced significantly the tariff request, but its benefits was actually abated by the currency hedging cost, highlighting an issue when talking about international public finance that is mostly provided in hard currency. On the right-hand side, the currency hedging was treated differently and left on the national policymaker side, so the impact of concessional finance was completely felt in the reduction of the CSP tariff. Finally, the last lesson is on how we can improve policy deployment besides providing financial resources, but through capacity building and knowledge transfer. First of all, we've seen that international public finance and policymakers can invest resources on providing reliable solar irradiation data, and this can reduce expected performance risk and thereby project cost. This was successful in the case of South Africa, where a great deal of effort went into measuring the best site and identifying the best site with the highest irradiation levels. And this proved to be an issue in the first phase of the Indian policy, National Solar Mission, and has been actually corrected in for phase 2. Second, what international public finance can do is actually direct capacity building and knowledge transfer with local policymakers. We've seen how important was the effort of a few regional development banks in the case of Morocco in helping the national agency, the National Solar Agency, in drafting the process for the tender and ensure that the quality of the bids was of very high standards. Let me recap now these lessons and convert them in what we consider to be recommendation for policymakers. First of all, for national policymakers, we have proved to be the key drivers in deployment for CSP. Our research shows that first and foremost, they have to be able to provide a sufficient financial support and close the viability gap in order to attract private investment in the technology. Second, this support needs to be sustainable over time with their budget to avoid booms and bust, but also needs to be provided, needs to be dynamically adjusted and kept close to technology cost. Third, policymakers need to ensure that low cost and long maturity debt is available to address financing risk and reduce the cost of projects by a better management of their financial profile. Fourth, policy can ensure alignment of interest between the public and the private sector and set long-term policy goals in order to reduce the perception of both policy and investment risk from the investor side. Finally, they can invest and ensure that reliable on-site solar irradiation data is available before projects are committed and actually allocated. Finally, what can international public finance do? They can mitigate and help local policymakers to mitigate the risk that the private sector is not yet willing to bear, but it's important that they make sure that private actors share part of the project risk. They can close the viability gap or help closing the viability gap where single countries are willing to support the technology but they are unable to bear the full cost, thereby increasing the stability of the program and the perception of the risk from the investor side. Third, they can provide knowledge on policy tools and technology to local decision makers to improve the policy design before projects are allocated. Fourth, they need to attempt to reduce the cost of foreign currency hedging to avoid the benefit of their intervention to be offset by the cost of risk mitigation. And finally, especially as in CSP, project size are significantly larger than what the single institutions can often do. When intervening together with other international finance organizations, they need to harmonize requirements and adjust them to the context and to the stage of maturity of the technology itself. Well, I'll hand it over to Martin now for a final remarks on what the future holds for CSP.
Okay, thank you very much, Gianleo, for these lessons, and let's have a quick look into the future of CSP. With policymakers interested in scaling up CSP in the long term and reducing costs, they can actually take off from the lessons that Gianleo has just presented to you. All policymakers can try to provide high enough support, but also should decrease it over time to reflect falling technology costs. Secondly, policymakers should all consider social cost of carbon when comparing CSP to other technologies that can provide base load power or peak load power, as this can make a large difference. Moving on to national policymakers. In our view, they have to initiate a transition to local and private debt. Gianleo has just presented to you how important low-cost debt can mean, and certainly international public finance plays an important role there in the short and in the medium term. In the long term, just because of the sheer size of investment we need a transition to local and private debt. Secondly, national policymakers should, as soon as possible, start to remunerate system benefits. So not just pay for flat power tariffs, but also pay for peak prices, also for the ability of CSP to provide power reliably around the clock. Thirdly, international policymakers, in our view, should focus public finance on countries with high willingness to scale up CSP, as cost effectiveness is highest according to our knowledge. If all policymakers join forces and deploy at least 5 to 15 gigawatts of CSP, we expect there will be enough economies of scale, learning and planning certainty to reduce costs of CSP by 14 to 44%, and this could make CSP competitive in first markets like Morocco and South Africa at peak power prices.
Thank you very much, Martin. Yeah, that concludes the presentation. We hope that there were some interesting findings for you out there looking to deploy this technology. We would now encourage you to enter any questions that you have into the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner. I can see that Sergio Mora Castro has already written quite a lot of questions for us. We'll actually pause now as well, just for a couple of minutes to give you a chance to write some more questions, and then we'll be back online to answer those. Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Wow, there's some really interesting questions there. Great to see that everybody's so engaged. So let's begin with Sergio's question. I don't know if we're going to be able to answer everything that you asked, Sergio, but Gianleo is going to talk a little bit about the importance of solar irradiation.
Sergio, that's very interesting questions, and mostly, unfortunately, related to technology specifications where CPI is not an expert into. What we've seen is that the level of solar irradiation and especially the length of the rainy, cloudy seasons are certainly geographical limitations that makes this technology only suitable for a handful of countries on the planet where solar irradiation data, solar irradiation levels, amount of clouds, amount of rain are of a certain specification. So we don't have numbers on this. We haven't really focused on this side. I'm still. What is required for sustainability and complete with renewable resources? Well, that basically was the whole point of our study. We're trying to understand how what can policy make to make CSP competitive with other renewable sources. I mean, we believe that more deployment, economies of scale, especially trying CSP in new contexts with new technology specifications will help. Also, there is being CSP more, also a source of technology that can be stored. There is the point on remuneration system and remunerating the system benefits of the technology, but I think it's kind of like a bit beyond the scope of the webinar.
Thanks very much, Gianleo. So Bruno's question on drilling down into the expected cost reductions in the future. Martin, you were talking about the future of CSP. Can you answer that one?
Yeah, thank you. There are different sources from where these cost reductions will or could come from. There's certainly economies of scale. For instance, in production facilities, there will be learning both in the planning, the investments, but also the operation phases of the plant. There's certainly also potential in localization of the production of parts of CSP plants that could reduce costs if it's done in countries like India. And there may also be technological advancements, for instance, like higher pressure or higher temperature technologies that make CSP more efficient.
Thanks for that, Martin. I hope that answered your question, Bruno. Manuel Milan. Gianleo is going to take this question on the impact of the existing CSP model and basically the fact that there are only a small number of developers and contractors offering this technology.
Well, that's definitely one of the limitations of the industry, especially as it was. I mean, is compared to the other renewable technologies, is an high capex, high investment cost technology. Projects really require a lot of commitment of resources, and their investment cycle is much longer than any other than an PV plant. So it's poorly suited for like new businesses or for like new ventures. On the positive side, especially looking at the development in India, we've seen that like new developers or existing developers in that market have won projects and have tried to and have collaborated with new with construction developers from outside India. So in that case, this like combination of developer and construction as breakdown. It will take time for the industry to change the business model, but as more capacity is allocated, more we believe more businesses will enter the market, and hopefully with more competition.
Thank you very much, Gianleo. Question here from Adriano Berghi about the perspectives for deploying CSP in Brazil. Martin, do you want to also asking whether or not CPI is working with stakeholders in Brazil on this?
Thank you for this question. Indeed, Brazil is an interesting market. There's some CSP plans in planning. We haven't looked at the Brazilian case because there were no plans that were advanced enough for our type of analysis, but we'll certainly look forward to see what's going on in Brazil, and hope some of the lessons we have drawn from this case study could be applied.
And there's also a question here from Sarah Dimson. Martin, what agency program can effectively coordinate and lead the joint forces effort? Do you want to take that?
Yes, thank you. We haven't looked in detail we haven't done an institutional analysis on which agency could actually coordinate these efforts. As we have seen from our lessons, certainly national policymakers with their key roles, but also international public finance institutions out there that want to invest in CSP have to coordinate their efforts. There are also international organizations like the International Energy Agency and the International Renewable Energy Agency that gather a lot of important information on CSP, and certainly coordination within these institutions will also be most welcome.
Thank you, Martin. And we have a question from, let's have a look here, from Julien on, do you think Morocco is the right country to push such an expensive technology? I know Gianleo has a lot of experience there about what policymakers' objectives were, so perhaps he can talk on that.
Yeah. Our study wasn't focused on what were the options for the country as we did the case study after the project had been allocated. But I think it's more important in this case to put it in the context of the objectives. And CSP, compared to the other renewable sources for Morocco, was pretty crucial for the potential to store the electricity and provide power during peak load in Morocco. And peak load in Morocco occurs after sunset between, if I remember correctly, 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. So in that moment, the technology was able to replace the more expensive fossil fuel they import, and this oil, and offset one of the main sources of their imported fossil fuel deficit.
Thank you very much, Gianleo. So we will be wrapping this up in a few minutes. If you have any questions, then I encourage you to type them in now, and we will try and get through all of them before the end. But we've just got a few minutes left. So there's a question from Pablo about a recent article in California. Sorry, Pablo, I don't think that's something that we actually looked at in the study, so we're not something we're able to comment on. Alex wants to know if there are any major national policy efforts geared towards bringing down costs through the development of local supply chains. Martin, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for this good question. There are indeed several governments that are trying to bring supply chains to their country. For instance, in the case of India, we studied, they have minimum local content requirements. But actually, the impacts were not really large of that because it was really easy to localize a large part. We estimated that the plant we looked at had a local content of around 60 to 70%. There are also, depending on the goals you have in your policy, pros and cons of these local content requirements. So certainly the pro is you can certainly attract more local production. On the con side, this may also increase your cost as you may not choose the most cost-effective technology. We have also found in the Indian case that actually long-term policy certainty is an important driver for localizing local content. It was both the driver for the developer to step in here and to invest in this market, but also as there's no certainty beyond the first phase, some of the technology providers were not yet able to localize their content in the Indian context.
Thank you very much for that, Martin. And thanks, Tim and David, for contributing answers to the question that we didn't deal with. Sarah Dimson is asking about the characteristics of the institutional support systems necessary for CSP to take off in non-OECD countries. John Leo, can you take that?
Yes, I mean, it's quite a large topic and a complex one, but I'll try to summarize the key points that we've seen. Being CSP, high investment cost technology with long payback ratios, and it's foremost importance that the institutional setting in the countries where these investments occur are actually prompt is stable. We have focused in this presentation a few times on long-term policy goals. It's important that the investor can see much further down as these investments will basically yield returns for 20-25 years. It's important. One of the main concerns when in all the case studies has seen the credit quality of the power of taker. Most of these projects have power purchase agreements that guarantee the revenue base and basically make the projects financially viable. It's important that the power of taker, the entity buying the power and paying the power from now to the 25 years down the line is reputable, is stable, has enough financial resources. In the case of Morocco, it was a governmental agency whose financial stability is actually being backed by the government and by a credit facility from the World Bank. In the case of India, it was a national agency, and investors required actually a direct backing from the government. In the case of South Africa, it's the largest utility in the country, with a much larger business size than the CSP. So in a nutshell, these are the institutional requirement from the investor. It's what makes an infrastructure roadmap possible, but also specific to the size of CSP plants and their long-term financing cycle is the stability and expected stability over time of the off-taker.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. We've come to the end of the webinar. I hope that we managed to answer the questions that you had. I will put up the last slide now. If you have further questions, then please do feel free to get in contact with Martin and Gian Leo. Yeah, as I say, thank you very much for your interest and for your questions. Thank you also to CIF for their technical and financial support during carrying out this project. There will also be financially and technically supporting us on a new project on geothermal, looking at the use of the role of public finance in promoting that, another promising renewable technology, interesting a lot of policymakers around the world. What else can I say? Well, yeah, please feel free to send an email if you have more questions. The recorded webinar will be available on our website shortly, and we will send an email through to you with a recording of it too. So, yeah, great to speak to you. We're shutting off the audio now. I'll leave the slide up so you can take the details now down if you need it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.